It all started with a simple complaint. A complaint I never thought would lead to the fight of my life. I had been living in the neighborhood for years, peacefully minding my own business, maintaining my property as best I could. The HOA, Homeowners Association, was always a bit of a hassle, but I knew the rules and followed them. At least, I thought I did. What I didn't know was that I was about to be targeted by one of the most ruthless and manipulative people I'd ever met, Karen, the president of the HOA. It started with the usual notice about my mailbox. It was leaning slightly to one side, nothing that a few minutes of work wouldn't fix. But Karen, always the stickler for details, sent me a formal complaint. I didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a mailbox. But Karen had other plans. A few weeks later, I received another notice. This time, it was about my front lawn. Apparently, the grass had grown a little too long, and it wasn't up to code. I wasn't thrilled with the idea of trimming my lawn for the third time in a week, but I complied. However, as I stood there with my mower, sweating in the sun, I noticed something strange. Karen was standing on the sidewalk, watching me like a hawk. Her eyes were narrow, calculating, as if she was waiting for me to make a mistake. That's when I first realized that this wasn't about the lawn, the mailbox, or any of the other minor complaints. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce the rules. She was trying to control me, to break me down bit by bit until I was nothing more than a compliant, silent member of her HOA dictatorship. But I wasn't going to let her. I'd been through enough in life to know that you don't let bullies get away with things, especially not when you've done nothing wrong. Things started to escalate after that. It wasn't long before I started hearing whispers from my neighbors, people who had been intimidated into paying fines or complying with Karen's arbitrary rules. One of my neighbors, Sarah, told me that Karen had been pressuring people into selling their homes, claiming that they were non-compliant and devaluing the neighborhood. Sarah was terrified, convinced that Karen was using the HOA to exploit people for her own gain. The more I heard, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was a criminal mastermind, using her position to manipulate and extort the entire community. Then, one evening, everything changed. I had just finished a long day of work and was unwinding in my living room when I heard a knock at the door. It was around 8 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I was greeted by the sight of two police officers standing on my porch, their faces stern. "Are you your name?" one of them asked, his voice firm. "Yes, that's me." "What's going on?" I asked, my heart starting to race. "You're under suspicion of vandalism," the officer said. "We have a report stating that you defaced HOA property. We need to speak with you." My mind spun. Vandalism? I hadn't done anything of the sort. But before I could speak, the officer showed me a picture on his phone. It was a photo of the HOA Community Center, the large sign out front, now graffitied with spray-painted words. The words read, "HOA Karen is a fraud." My stomach sank. I had nothing to do with this. I would never deface property, especially not in such a blatant way. But the officers weren't interested in listening to my side of the story. They had a picture, they had a report, and that was all they needed. They arrested me on the spot, charging me with vandalism. My whole world turned upside down in an instant. The next few days were a blur. I was in and out of the police station, talking to my attorney, trying to piece together what had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all orchestrated. Someone wanted to frame me, and that someone was Karen. I was convinced that she had set me up to take the fall for this act of vandalism. The graffiti, the accusation, it was all too perfect, too calculated. Karen had managed to paint me as the villain, using her connections to get the police involved and force me into a corner. I wasn't going to let her win. I started digging into the situation. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The HOA surveillance cameras had captured footage of someone in a hooded sweatshirt sneaking onto the property the night the graffiti appeared. The figure, though obscured, was clearly not me. But who was it? Who was trying to frame me? I kept looking, asking questions, and slowly, the puzzle pieces started to fall into place. That's when I discovered something chilling. Karen had been using her position in the HOA to cover up a massive corruption scheme. She had been funneling HOA funds into her own pocket, inflating the prices of repairs and pocketing the difference. She had also been manipulating property sales, pressuring homeowners to sell their properties at a loss, then flipping them for a huge profit. It was all starting to make sense. Karen had been using the HOA to fund her own personal wealth, and when I started getting too close to the truth, she tried to shut me down by framing me for vandalism. But Karen hadn't anticipated what I would do next. With the help of my attorney, I began gathering evidence of Karen's corruption. I contacted neighbors who had been affected by her manipulative tactics. One by one, they came forward with their stories, each one revealing more about Karen's illegal activities. I also discovered a hidden trail of bank transfers that linked Karen directly to several shell companies. The money she had stolen from the HOA was being funneled through these companies, making it nearly impossible to track. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Armed with the evidence I had collected, I went straight to the local news station. I reached out to a journalist who had been covering HOA corruption in the area and handed over everything I had uncovered. The journalist was shocked at the extent of Karen's scheme and promised to run the story. Within hours, Karen's corruption was splashed across the news. The story went viral, and the community was in an uproar. Residents who had been afraid to speak up now found the courage to come forward, sharing their own experiences with Karen's bullying and manipulation. The authorities quickly launched a full investigation into Karen's activities, and within days, she was arrested for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The community that she had once held in her iron grip was finally free from her manipulation. The case wasn't over, but Karen was behind bars, and I had exposed her for what she truly was. The woman who had tried to frame me for vandalism had been brought to justice, and the entire neighborhood was waking up to the truth. The aftermath of Karen's arrest was nothing short of chaotic. The community, once silent and fearful, had found their voice. People who had lived in fear of her manipulation and bullying for years were finally speaking out, sharing their experiences with local reporters and authorities. The stories were heartbreaking. People who had been pressured into selling their homes at a loss, others who had been financially ruined by the inflated repair bills Karen had orchestrated through the HOA, and many more who had suffered in silence, too terrified to stand up to her. The local news outlets were abuzz with the scandal. Karen's name was all over the papers, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood seemed alive with a sense of justice. The residents who had once cowered in fear of her were now rallying together, supporting each other in their newfound courage. I felt a sense of pride and relief, knowing that I had played a part in bringing Karen's corrupt empire down. But as the media storm calmed down, something inside me told me that the fight wasn't truly over. Sure, Karen was in jail, but the web of corruption she had woven went beyond her. There were still people who had been complicit in her actions, still allies who had enabled her to continue her exploitation for years. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about exposing one woman's greed. This was about rooting out an entire system that had allowed her to thrive at the expense of everyone around her. A few weeks after Karen's arrest, I received a strange phone call. The voice on the other end was low, almost inaudible. It took me a moment to recognize it, but when I did, my heart sank. It was Richard, one of Karen's former business associates. He had been involved in some of the shady deals she had made, and I had suspected for some time that he knew more than he let on. "I need to talk to you." Richard's voice crackled through the phone. "Karen's not the only one you need to worry about. There's more to this than you realize. I can help, but you need to be careful." I felt a surge of adrenaline. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "You're not the only one who wants to take her down," Richard said, his voice trembling with urgency. "But there's a bigger game being played here. Karen might be in jail, but there are still people behind the scenes who are running the show. You don't want to get tangled up in this mess, but if you really want to see this through, you need to know who's pulling the strings." I had been expecting something like this. Karen may have been the face of the corruption, but I had always suspected that there were more powerful forces at play, forces that had allowed her to manipulate the entire neighborhood. I agreed to meet Richard, but with the understanding that I needed to be cautious. It was becoming clear that exposing Karen wasn't going to be enough. There were other people involved, and if I wanted to put an end to her reign of terror for good, I had to take down the entire network. The meeting with Richard was set for the following day. As I walked into the dimly lit cafe where we had agreed to meet, my mind was racing. I had already been through so much to get to this point, and now it seemed like I was about to uncover even more. Richard was sitting in the back booth, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if expecting someone to recognize him. When he saw me, he waved me over. "Sit down," he said quickly. "We don't have much time." As I sat down across from him, I could see that he was sweating, his hands fidgeting nervously with a napkin. It was clear he wasn't as confident as he had been on the phone. "I've been trying to get out of this for years," Richard said, his voice shaky. Karen was the face of it, but she wasn't the one pulling all the strings. There's a network of developers, politicians, and businessmen who have been using the HOA for their own gain, and Karen was just the middleman. She did the dirty work, but they were the ones who stood to gain the most. Richard went on to explain how Karen had been working with a group of influential real estate developers who had been using the HOA to manipulate property values and force homeowners to sell at below-market prices. They had created a system where Karen could pressure homeowners into selling their properties under duress, and then the developers would flip those homes for massive profits. It was a well-oiled machine, and Karen had been the one keeping it all running. "What do you mean by they were the ones pulling the strings?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who are these people?" Richard hesitated, glancing around nervously. "I don't have all the names, but I know some of them. There's a guy, let's call him Jeff. He's a major developer in the area, and he's been working with Karen for years. He's the one who would give her the go-ahead for every deal, every shady transaction. And then there's the city councilman who's been getting kickbacks for helping to cover up everything." I felt my blood run cold. This was bigger than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just Karen I had to worry about anymore. There were people in power, people with real influence, who had been profiting off the misery of homeowners. And Karen had been their pawn. But now that she was out of the picture, I knew they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. "I need to know everything you have on these people," I said, my voice low and determined. "If we're going to take them down, we need the whole picture." Richard nodded, his eyes wary. "I can help, but it won't be easy. These people are dangerous. If you go after them, they'll do everything they can to make you disappear." I wasn't intimidated. I had already fought the hardest battle of my life, and now I was ready to take on whatever came next. The truth was out there, and I wasn't going to let Karen, Jeff, or anyone else get away with what they had done. Richard looked around once more, his eyes darting nervously before he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not proud of what I've done," he admitted, "but I can't sit back and let them get away with it. I have files, documents, proof that Karen and Jeff have been laundering money through the HOA for years, using fake contractors and inflated bills to pocket the difference." I leaned in, my heart racing. This was the breakthrough I had been waiting for. The corrupt network I suspected was now exposed, and Richard was offering to help me bring it down. The idea of taking down Karen's entire operation and stopping Jeff's shady dealings made me feel a sense of power I hadn't experienced before. I had been pushed around for too long, but now I was about to turn the tables. Richard handed me a manila envelope filled with documents and files. As I flipped through them, I saw detailed contracts, bank transfers, and email chains that showed the lengths Karen and Jeff had gone to in order to manipulate the system. Every page revealed a new level of deceit. It was all there. The proof that Karen had been working hand in hand with corrupt developers, funneling money through fake repairs and inflating the costs for HOA projects. "This is more than enough to take them down," I said, looking up at Richard. "But we need to move fast. If they catch wind of this, we could be in danger." Richard nodded. "I've already made arrangements. I've backed up everything to a secure server. If anything happens to me, the evidence is safe. But the real challenge is going to be getting the authorities to act quickly. They've been slow to move on this, and I'm afraid Jeff might try to sabotage the investigation." I could see the fear in Richard's eyes, but it only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to let these people continue to profit at the expense of others. The community had already suffered too much because of Karen's reign, and it was time for justice to prevail. The next day, I contacted the authorities and arranged to meet with them, bringing the documents and evidence Richard had provided. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, and I had to prepare myself for the possibility that the people involved might try to cover their tracks. But with the evidence in hand, we had a fighting chance. The authorities were shocked by the scale of the corruption. They began to mobilize a task force to investigate Karen's dealings, and within a matter of days, they had begun tracing the money trails back to Jeff and the other individuals who had been complicit in the scheme. However, as the investigation intensified, so did the threats. One evening, as I was heading home from work, I received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was deep, menacing. "You think you're going to win, don't you?" the man said, his tone icy. "If you don't stop digging, you'll regret it. You have no idea who you're messing with." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what this was. One last attempt to intimidate me into backing off. But I wasn't going to let fear stop me now. I had come too far. I had already risked everything to expose Karen, and I wasn't about to let a phone call stop me from finishing what I started. I reported the threat to the authorities, but I knew it wouldn't be the last. The people behind this corruption weren't going to let go easily. They would stop at nothing to protect their interests, and I had to be prepared for whatever came next. But I had one thing they didn't, the truth, and the truth would always win. Days later, I received another unexpected visit, this time from a neighbor I had never spoken to before. His name was Paul, and he had lived in the neighborhood for years. He told me he had information that could help bring down Karen and Jeff for good. I was skeptical at first, but Paul insisted. "I've been keeping an eye on things," he said, his voice low and cautious. "I know how Karen operates, and I know Jeff too. They've been covering up their tracks for years. But there's something you need to know. Karen wasn't just using the HOA to manipulate people. She was blackmailing some of the city officials to keep her deals under the radar. She's been using her position to get what she wants, and it's time someone stopped her." This was the breakthrough I had been hoping for. If Paul could provide more evidence of Karen's connections to corrupt city officials, it would be the final nail in her coffin. I knew I had to act fast, but I also knew that the danger was escalating. These people had the power to ruin lives, and they weren't going to let me stop them without a fight. Paul explained that he had seen Karen meeting with some of these officials, exchanging documents and making deals in secret. He had even overheard one conversation about a backdoor deal regarding a new construction project in the neighborhood. Karen had been using her influence to get kickbacks from these city officials, all while pretending to be the benevolent HOA president. She had been a puppet master, pulling the strings behind the scenes to enrich herself and her associates. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The more I learned, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just a bully who ran a corrupt HOA. She was a criminal mastermind who had been using the system to manipulate everyone around her. And now, it was time to bring her down once and for all. As the investigation continued, more neighbors began to come forward with their stories, sharing how Karen had used threats and manipulation to get what she wanted. The pressure on Karen and her associates was mounting, and I could see the cracks beginning to show. They were running out of options, and the truth was becoming undeniable. It wasn't long before the authorities launched another raid, this time targeting Jeff's real estate holdings and the city officials who had been working with him. They seized documents, financial records, and emails that painted a clear picture of the network of corruption that had been operating under Karen's reign. It was only a matter of time before the full extent of her crimes would be exposed, and Karen would face the consequences of her actions. But as the investigation gathered momentum, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was still holding something back. There was one last piece to the puzzle I needed to find, one final truth that could bring everything to light. I wasn't going to rest until I had it. As the investigation continued to unravel Karen's web of lies, I couldn't help but feel the mounting pressure. Every new piece of evidence we discovered seemed to open up even more questions, more avenues that needed to be explored. The authorities had already seized a significant amount of documentation from Jeff's properties, but there were still loose ends. It was clear that Karen wasn't just a part of this operation. She was the linchpin, and I had to find the last key to fully dismantle her empire. Then, one day, I received an unexpected email. It was from a source I had never encountered before. The message was cryptic but intriguing. "I know what Karen is hiding," If you want to expose everything, meet me at the old warehouse by the docks. Midnight. My heart raced as I read the message again. Who could this be? Was it a trap? I hesitated, weighing my options. But something inside me told me this was the breakthrough I had been waiting for. If there was one final secret Karen was keeping, this could be my chance to uncover it. By midnight, I found myself standing outside an old warehouse, my mind racing. I had no backup, no authorities nearby. It was just me and the mystery of what was hidden in that warehouse. The silence of the night was almost suffocating as I approached the door, careful not to make a sound. As I stepped inside, I saw a figure standing in the shadows. "Are you here to stop her?" the person asked, their voice low and hushed. I squinted to make out the figure, my heart pounding. "Who are you?" I asked cautiously. "I'm someone who knows exactly what Karen is up to," they replied. "I can't tell you everything here, but I can give you the proof. She's been running a much bigger operation than you realize." The person handed me a small flash drive, looking over their shoulder nervously. "Everything you need is on here. If you really want to expose her, this is the missing piece. But you need to act quickly. She won't let you take her down easily. I've been watching her for years. Trust me, this goes deeper than you think." I grabbed the flash drive, my hand shaking. "What's on here?" I asked. "I can't say, but it's enough to end her reign for good," the person replied, before quickly disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. My mind was racing, processing everything that had just transpired. The flash drive could hold everything I needed to bring Karen down once and for all. But the question remained, who had given it to me and why? Were they truly trying to help? Or were they just using me as a pawn in a bigger game? I decided to head straight home, where I immediately plugged the flash drive into my computer. The file was encrypted, and I spent hours trying to crack the password. It wasn't easy, but I couldn't afford to waste any more time. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I managed to break the encryption. What I saw on the screen took my breath away. It wasn't just a list of financial transactions. It was a full-blown operation, detailing how Karen had been manipulating the HOA's funds and using the power of her position to buy properties under false pretenses. But the most shocking part of the file was the involvement of several prominent city officials, some of whom had been working directly with Karen to facilitate her illegal transactions. They had been receiving kickbacks in exchange for turning a blind eye to her corruption. The scope of the operation was staggering. Karen had been using her position not only to bully homeowners and flip properties, but she had also been running a full-scale money laundering scheme involving multiple high-profile individuals. There were documents outlining offshore accounts, shell companies, and fake contracts, each one a clear indication that Karen had been working with a network of corrupt officials and developers who had been profiting off the neighborhood's misfortune. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about a much larger conspiracy. She wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. She was a key player in a web of criminal activity that stretched far beyond the boundaries of our neighborhood. If I didn't act soon, she could get away with it all. I immediately contacted my attorney, urging him to take a look at the documents. He agreed to meet me the following morning to go over the findings. As we sat in his office, I could see the shock on his face as he scanned through the files. He had seen corruption before, but this was something else entirely. "This is a gold mine of evidence," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This will take down Karen and everyone involved in this scheme. But we need to be careful. If we go public with this, there will be backlash. These people have power." I nodded, understanding the risks involved. But I knew that staying silent wasn't an option. If I let Karen and her associates get away with this, the corruption would continue, and more innocent people would suffer. I had to do something, and I had to do it fast. Over the next few days, we began working with the authorities, carefully presenting the evidence we had gathered. The police launched a full-scale investigation, contacting the city officials implicated in the scheme and beginning to subpoena the records related to the shell companies and offshore accounts. It wasn't long before the pressure started to mount on Karen and her associates. But even as the investigation gained momentum, Karen wasn't sitting idle. She had always been a master at playing the victim, and now, With everything closing in on her, she was attempting to manipulate the situation once again. Her legal team was working overtime, filing motions to dismiss the charges and trying to discredit the evidence we had. They were trying to buy time, hoping that the investigation would stall long enough for Karen to escape. I wasn't about to let that happen. The fight wasn't over yet, and I wasn't backing down. With every piece of evidence, with every witness who came forward, Karen's empire of corruption was crumbling. It was only a matter of time before she would face the full extent of her actions. The community had finally woken up to the truth. Karen's hold on the HOA, her stranglehold on the neighborhood, was slipping away. The residents who had once been too afraid to speak out were now emboldened by the truth. They knew that they weren't alone anymore. But even as Karen's world began to collapse, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone she had tried to control, intimidate, and exploit. And I wasn't about to let her get away with it now. The battle was far from over. Even though we had exposed the extent of Karen's corruption, the fight was just beginning. The authorities were digging deeper, and each new revelation was adding more fuel to the fire. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Her legal team was working tirelessly to discredit the evidence, twisting the truth and playing dirty to protect their client. As the days dragged on, I could feel the pressure mounting. Karen had made a career out of manipulating people, and now that the tables had turned, she was doing everything in her power to stop the truth from coming to light. I spent hours going over the documents, piecing together the final pieces of the puzzle. The more I uncovered, the more disgusting the whole operation seemed. Karen had been using her position to create a network of shell companies, inflating the prices of repairs and laundering money through fake contracts. But it wasn't just her that I was fighting anymore. There were powerful people behind the scenes, people who had been helping her cover her tracks for years. The deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. I met with my attorney again to discuss our next steps. We couldn't afford to let Karen slip away. The authorities had begun taking action, but I knew that if we didn't push forward, Karen might find a way to get out of this. She had already tried to manipulate the investigation, and I wasn't sure if we could trust anyone involved with her network. "We need to make sure she doesn't get away with this," my attorney said, his tone serious. "The evidence is overwhelming, but we have to make sure we keep the pressure on. If we let up, she might find a way to wriggle out of this." I agreed. We couldn't stop now. We had come so far, and there was no turning back. But as I thought about what would come next, I realized that Karen was more dangerous than I had given her credit for. She had manipulated the HOA for years, and now that she was backed into a corner, I knew she would stop at nothing to protect herself. The media attention had only grown in the days following Karen's arrest, and the pressure on her legal team had intensified. News outlets were running stories about her real estate empire, her corrupt dealings, and the way she had used her position to exploit the community. The more I heard, the more I realized that this was bigger than I had ever imagined. Karen was only one part of the puzzle. The real question was how deep the corruption ran and who else was involved. In the days that followed, I received an anonymous tip from someone who claimed to have more information about Karen's dealings. The message was vague, but it pointed to a secret meeting that Karen had attended several months ago, one that was allegedly related to her offshore accounts. I knew I had to follow this lead, but I couldn't help but feel that I was stepping deeper into something dangerous. Whoever was involved in this scheme wasn't going to let go easily. I contacted the authorities again, sharing the tip I had received. They were eager to investigate, but warned me that this could be a risky move. Karen had powerful allies, and there was no telling who would try to silence us. But I wasn't about to back down. I had come too far, and there was no way I was letting Karen walk away unscathed. The following day, we managed to secure access to surveillance footage from a meeting that Karen had attended. It was a breakthrough. In the footage, Karen was seen speaking with a known real estate mogul, someone with a long history of shady business practices. They were discussing properties, deals, and what seemed to be plans for future land acquisitions. It was clear that Karen was working with some of the most corrupt figures in the industry, using her HOA position to manipulate homeowners into selling their properties for pennies on the dollar. We immediately presented the footage to the authorities, and it sent shockwaves through the investigation. The truth was finally beginning to surface, and Karen's empire of manipulation and greed was crumbling faster than she could keep up. But even as the noose tightened around her, Karen wasn't giving up. She had already proven she was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect herself. And now that her network was being exposed, she was desperate. Her next move was one I hadn't anticipated. The day after the footage was made public, I received a threatening message. It was an anonymous letter, but it was clear who it was from. "Stop digging or you'll regret it," the letter read. "You think you've won, but you haven't even begun to see the real power behind Karen. Stay out of it, or you'll pay the price." The threat shook me, but it only fueled my resolve. Karen wasn't going to scare me into stopping. I had come too far to let her silence me now. But as I looked over the letter, I realized that this was bigger than just Karen. There were powerful people involved in this, people who would do anything to protect their interests. And if they were willing to go this far to intimidate me, I knew I had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything we had uncovered could be swept under the rug. Despite the threats, I continued pushing forward. The authorities were now investigating not just Karen, but also her associates. They had subpoenaed financial records, investigated her connections to city officials, and were digging into the offshore accounts she had used to launder money. Every day, it seemed like more and more people were being dragged into the investigation. But I knew it wasn't enough. We needed to keep the pressure on. We needed to expose every last person who had helped Karen build her corrupt empire. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Karen's network was even larger than we had imagined. Her dealings had spread across multiple cities, and she had manipulated government contracts, construction projects, and real estate deals on an unprecedented scale. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. Karen wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. She was a criminal mastermind who had been using her position to enrich herself and her associates at the expense of everyone else. But even as the walls closed in around her, Karen wasn't about to give up without a fight. Her legal team continued to launch appeals, trying to delay the process, hoping for a breakthrough that would allow her to slip through the cracks. But every time they tried to fight back, we were ready. The authorities had gathered more than enough evidence to secure a conviction, and it was clear that Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. As Karen's appeals continued to stall the process, I could feel the tension building once more. Every day, it seemed like new threats were being made, not just against me, but also against the authorities and even some of the witnesses who had bravely come forward. Karen had long realized that her empire was crumbling, and she was doing everything in her power to escape the consequences of her actions. The authorities were making progress, but I knew it wouldn't be long before Karen made another attempt to wiggle her way out of this. Every time she was backed into a corner, she came out swinging. It was no surprise when I received an anonymous email from one of Karen's associates, a name I didn't recognize, but whose message felt too important to ignore. "We know what you're doing. You're making a huge mistake. Drop this now, and we'll make sure you're not dragged into this any further. If not, we'll ruin you." It was a threat, plain and simple, but the tone of it struck me as desperate. They were afraid. Karen's operation was falling apart, and they were trying to intimidate me into backing off before the entire system came crashing down on them. I didn't hesitate for a second. I forwarded the email to my attorney and the authorities immediately. If Karen and her associates thought they could scare me into silence, they were sorely mistaken. This wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about taking down a system of corruption that had harmed so many people. But the threats weren't the only thing I had to deal with. As the investigation gained momentum, I began to notice something strange. It wasn't just Karen's lawyer making moves to discredit the case. There were rumors swirling about other residents in the neighborhood, neighbors I had once trusted, who seemed to be aligning themselves with Karen's side of things. Some of them had even gone as far as to defend her in public, claiming she was just doing her job, and that the charges against her were exaggerated. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe Karen had managed to persuade a few people to stand by her, but I started noticing patterns. Those who defended her were often the same ones who had benefited from her shady dealings, the ones who had gotten preferential treatment in property matters or had been silenced through financial incentives. I decided to take a closer look at these individuals. I spoke to a few neighbors, particularly those who had sold their homes to Karen or her associates under questionable circumstances. It wasn't long before the truth started to come out. People were starting to piece together the larger picture. Karen hadn't just manipulated the HOA rules for her own gain. She had set up an entire network of people who helped her control the neighborhood, ensuring that anyone who questioned her would be silenced. The more I learned, the more dangerous the situation seemed. The people involved in this weren't just local businessmen or developers. They were entrenched in the fabric of the community, making it nearly impossible for the authorities to root them all out. If Karen had been working with these people, she was part of something much bigger than I had imagined. And as much as I wanted to see her behind bars, I knew that if we were going to bring her down for good, we had to go deeper. With the investigation reaching its climax, the pressure on the HOA intensified. More whistleblowers started coming forward, each with new details about Karen's operations. Some spoke of how she had used intimidation and fear to keep them silent, while others revealed how she had manipulated the system to collect kickbacks from the contractors she hired for various neighborhood repairs. I kept thinking back to how much damage Karen had done. She had single-handedly turned what should have been a quiet, peaceful neighborhood into a community of fear and suspicion. But now, the community was starting to fight back. It wasn't just the homeowners who had been directly impacted by Karen's actions. It was everyone who had ever felt the sting of her power, her ability to manipulate and control. People were finally starting to realize that it wasn't just one woman abusing the HOA. It was the whole system that needed to be dismantled. As I pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle, I realized the fight wasn't over yet. Karen might have been arrested, but there were still the other players in her operation, people who had been profiting off her manipulation. These were the people who needed to be exposed, and it wasn't going to be easy. Karen had set up her network with an almost frightening level of detail, and breaking it apart was going to take time and effort. I had learned the hard way that you couldn't let your guard down. Even though Karen was in jail, I knew that her influence was still alive and well, creeping into the corners of the community like a cancer. The fight wasn't just about bringing her to justice. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever use the HOA as a weapon again. Every day, I felt the weight of what was at stake. If I faltered now, all the hard work would be for nothing. I couldn't let that happen. This was bigger than me. It was about the future of the neighborhood, the people who had suffered in silence for too long. I sat down with my attorney to discuss our next steps. The investigation had exposed a network of corruption, but the real work was just beginning. We needed to continue digging, continue pushing, and most importantly, continue exposing those who were still part of Karen's scheme. We couldn't stop until every last person was held accountable. But as we prepared for the next phase of the investigation, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. Karen may have thought she had won when she manipulated the HOA, but I had finally turned the tables. And no matter how much power she had, there was no way she was going to get away with it. The investigation had shifted into full gear now. The authorities were tirelessly working through the evidence we had presented, and the more they uncovered, the more devastating Karen's network of corruption appeared. People who had previously been reluctant to speak out began to come forward, and the floodgates had opened. Karen's grip on the community was slipping, but I knew better than to assume she had already lost. A cornered animal was at its most dangerous, and Karen had proven time and time again that she was willing to do anything to protect her empire. I spent the following weeks in a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. The authorities were deep into their investigation, but I was still working behind the scenes to gather more evidence. I learned a long time ago that if you wanted to defeat someone like Karen, you had to outsmart them, anticipate their next move. That's why, despite the progress that had been made, I knew that she was not done fighting. She would find a way to retaliate, and I had to be ready. One day, just when I thought things might be slowing down, I received an unexpected call from my neighbor Tom. He had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, and had seen the worst of Karen's reign firsthand. Tom's voice was shaky, and it was clear he had something urgent to say. "You need to come over now," he said. "I've seen something I didn't think was possible." I rushed over to Tom's house, my mind racing. When I arrived, I found him pacing nervously in his front yard. He motioned for me to come inside. "You won't believe this," he said, leading me to the back of his house, where a stack of documents lay on the table. I found these in Karen's old office. My stomach dropped. "What is it?" "It's worse than you can imagine," Tom said, pointing to the papers. "These are the official records from the HOA, and they go back years. There are contracts here, fraudulent ones, documents showing that Karen had been skimming off the top of every neighborhood project she approved. And not just a little bit. She was inflating prices by hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that money was being funneled into offshore accounts." I felt a rush of anger surge through me. Karen had been stealing from the community for years, all while pretending to be the diligent president of the HOA, keeping the neighborhood in line. But these documents were undeniable proof of her manipulation. And now, Tom was handing me the key to bringing everything crashing down. "We can't wait any longer," I said, feeling the weight of the moment. "We have to take this straight to the authorities." Tom nodded, his face serious. "But we need to be careful. If Karen finds out we have these, she'll do whatever it takes to make sure they disappear." I knew he was right, but I couldn't back down now. With this evidence, we could finally expose the full extent of Karen's corruption. We rushed to make copies of the documents, taking every precaution to ensure we had multiple backups. If something happened to us or the originals were destroyed, we had to be ready to fight back. The next day, we presented everything to the authorities. The shock on their faces was enough to tell me that this would be the final nail in Karen's coffin. These new revelations went beyond just her manipulation of the HOA. They opened up a massive criminal operation involving bribery, money laundering, and the exploitation of homeowners who had trusted her. There was no way Karen could walk away from this. But the deeper we got into the investigation, the more dangerous it became. Word spread quickly that we had uncovered something huge, and Karen's remaining allies were not happy. I received another anonymous message, this time more threatening than the last. "If you think you've won, you're wrong," the message read. "Karen is just the tip of the iceberg. The people who are backing her aren't going to let this go. If you keep digging, you'll regret it." My heart raced as I read the message. I wasn't sure if it was Karen's doing or if it was one of her allies, but the threat was clear. They were watching me. I couldn't let fear stop me now, but I also had to be smart. This wasn't just about taking down Karen. It was about exposing an entire network of corruption that reached further than I had ever anticipated. Despite the increasing danger, I pushed forward. We couldn't let Karen and her associates walk away from this. The stakes had never been higher. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how many lives Karen had ruined in her pursuit of power and wealth. The entire neighborhood had been held hostage by her manipulation, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. Then a breakthrough came. One of Karen's former employees, a woman named Linda, came forward. She had worked with Karen for years, but had left the organization after realizing the extent of the corruption. Linda was terrified, but she was willing to testify against Karen, even if it meant putting herself in danger. Linda revealed that Karen had been using her position to pressure employees into falsifying records and manipulating HOA funds to cover up her criminal activities. With Linda's testimony, we finally had the smoking gun we needed to make Karen's case airtight. We presented her account to the authorities, and they immediately took action, launching a full-scale investigation into Karen's operations. It wasn't long before more people came forward, corroborating Linda's story and adding to the growing list of charges against Karen and her network. The investigation moved quickly after that. The pressure on Karen mounted, and her allies began to turn on her. The network she had so carefully built began to unravel, and people who had been too afraid to speak out for years finally found the courage to do so. It became clear that Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end, and she was running out of places to hide. But even as her world crumbled around her, Karen remained defiant. She hired a new legal team, one that was determined to fight every step of the way. But the truth was no longer on her side, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before she would face the full consequences of her actions. The neighborhood, once afraid to speak out, was now united in its determination to see justice done. Karen's empire of corruption had come crashing down, and the people she had manipulated for so long were finally free. But for me, the journey wasn't over yet. I had exposed Karen, But there were still more pieces of the puzzle to uncover. The fight for justice was just beginning. As Karen's empire continued to unravel, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. After everything she had done to manipulate and exploit the neighborhood, seeing her finally face justice was a victory for us all. But the fight wasn't over yet. There were still people out there who needed to be held accountable. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more about how corruption is brought to light, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more real-life tales of courage, justice, and standing up for what's right. You won't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned, and thanks for being part of this journey with me.